There we go. All right, welcome CRC members. Today we are joined by our guest, David Sandelman, the co-founder of Vermont Dry and Cure Technologies and the inventor of the Vapor Troll technology. They have 18 related patents with multiple patents pending. And today David is going to be talking about managing post-harvest environment, also known as the science of drying, curing, and storage. So without further ado, David, I'd love for you to take it away.
Thank you, Alice. So what we like to say is there's only one difference between art and science. In science, the universe is in control. In art, you are. And way too often these things get conflated and people are doing drying and curing and they think they're doing science, but they're doing art. And very often things they're chasing that they think is art is really science that's after them. Well, what I like to say is you just can't fuck with physics. So why do we dry and cure? And the first thing you want to do is get to a shelf-stable product that's not going to go moldy. And also, you really can't smoke or burn a wet flower. So we got to get rid of that free available water out of the flower to get to shelf stability. If you take out too much water, you're going to wind up with an over-dried, dusty product. If you leave water in there that's unbound, you're going to get mold and microbes. And if you remove the water too fast, it's going to be a harsh hay smell, just a real poor quality smokable flower. So what we're after is getting to a shelf-stable, high-quality flower. So what are we doing today? How are we doing it? We're pretty much using repurposed air conditioning, comfort cooling equipment, and dehumidifiers. All of this equipment was designed to remove water continuously. You buy a Quest dehumidifier, and it is going to be rated in pints per day. That's its purpose in life, is just keep sucking water out. An air conditioner basically does the same thing. As long as the compressor is running, it's just going to keep on pulling water out. So you really don't have process control here. What you're doing is repurposing comfort cooling equipment to serve a purpose. So what are we doing today? We're putting the flower into these spaces with dehumidifiers and air conditioners. And if you don't remove the flower at the right time, it's going to be over-dried. So it's all about the timing. And this is where we get into art instead of science, is when is that flower going to be properly dried to stop and arrest the drying process. And it requires labor to move the flower from this space, into an area where we have arrested the drying process and gotten away from these pieces of equipment, air conditioners and dehumidifiers that are constantly removing moisture. So you wind up with, a bit of touchy-feely grow science as to when the flower is properly dried. In an organization, is it up to one person who really has that touchy feeling and is the expert, and that they become, an important part in this process? That's not a lot of SOP kind of stuff. And, do we need to pull a staff in on Sunday because we think the flower is going to be done and we don't want to leave it another day or two and wind up with over-dried flowers? So all of this wastes labor dollars moving people around. So we can see here, our first step is we hopefully dried the flowers and arrested it by putting it in a sealed container. But once we put it into the sealed container, that's when we start burping to remove any unbound water that might have been left in the flower. And you really don't know. At that point, the flower might have been already over-dried before it went into the sealed containers, or it can still have free available water. So we start this ritual of opening the jars to burp them. But burping a jar in New England in the winter is very different than opening a jar in Florida in the summer. So is this really science, or is this really a ritual that we're doing? And we're trying to have a process here. So what a lot of people say is, well, it's all about controlling humidity. Well, you really can't control humidity. This is a psychrometric chart. This chart explains what's going on in air as far as air temperature, the amount of water in the air, the state of that water vapor. And so if we look at this chart, the vertical blue line here is temperature. And we can move the line to the left or to the right by either adding or removing heat energy from the air. This horizontal green line is the amount of moisture, water vapor in that air. And we can move that up and down by either removing water vapor or adding water vapor to that space. This orange curved line is the resultant relative humidity. This is not something that you control. This is something that is a result of the intersection of the amount of temperature, energy in the air and the amount of water in the air. And where they intersect becomes the relative humidity. But there's no such thing as controlling relative humidity. Relative humidity is the result of two variables. A lot of people say, hey, I like keeping my room at a 60% relative humidity. And basically you go, yeah, which one of these 60% relative humidities would you like? All of these 60% relative humidities in the dark blue are different solutions to different dry bulb temperature, which is across the top of this chart, and dew point down the left side of the chart. And you can also express dew point in terms of pressure, vapor pressure. Here we're expressing it in millibar. So we picked one solution here that we found is the best for drying, curing, and storing a cannabis flower. That's at 68 degrees Fahrenheit with a dew point of 54 degrees, gives us a resulting relative humidity of 60%. But we're not controlling the relative humidity. The relative humidity is a result. An interesting thought experiment about this is imagine you have a box, a plexiglass box, a cubic foot, and you then place a couple of drops of water inside this sealed box. And now you have an absolute amount of water vapor inside this box. And if we measure, we're going to say, hey, the box has a 50% relative humidity is the air in the box. If we heat the air in the box, the relative humidity goes down, but we've not changed the amount of water vapor in there. The vapor pressure has remained the same in there. What's happened? By warming the air now has the ability to hold more water. So we haven't changed the amount of water in there. What we've done is change the air's capacity to hold more water. So the relative humidity in that box has gone down. Another way to view this is you got these two balloons here filled with water. Well, they're both filled at 90%. But one of them's got 18 ounces of water and one has 6 ounces of water. So you can see here, relative 90% is not very meaningful. We can flip the whole thing around. We put two, balloons here with 6 ounces in each, but one's 20% full and one's 90% full. So, talking in terms of relative humidity is not very scientific as far as being able to control a process. So how do we control it? We use vapor pressure. And you can use vapor pressure as a term, or you can use dew point as a term, because here's the equation. E is the vapor pressure, and TD in the equation, it's buried here and buried here, is the dew point. So anyone who really wants to make their brain hurt can flip this equation around and solve for TD, but you get the idea. If you know one, you can solve for the other. So let's talk about pressure and vapor pressure, air pressure. It all comes back to this guy Boyle and Boyle's law. When you measure the pressure in a tire, it doesn't really matter where the valve stem is. It could be at the top, it could be at the bottom, because the pressure throughout the tire is going to be equal. it is going to equalize throughout. Now, a lot of you have heard about vapor pressure deficit. Well, here's a real extreme of vapor pressure deficit. The tire had a high vapor pressure in it, and the pressure outside the tire was lower. And then once you put a hole in that tire, the deficit disappears, and the pressure in the tire wants to equalize with the pressure outside the tire. And here's, an everyday example of vapor pressure deficit and differences. And here you can tell right away that the mug on the left has a higher vapor pressure. Why? How? Because we can see the water vapor leaving it. So we know that that water has a higher vapor pressure in that mug. You can actually see the difference and the water vapor leaving it. On the other side, everyone knows the bottle on the right is colder. Why? Because the surface of that bottle is at or below the dew point of the air around it. And being at or below the dew point, condensation starts to form. And what we're doing is taking the water vapor in the air that's surrounding the bottle and turning it into liquid water. It's condensing on there. Now let's look at a flower and what happens with the vapor pressure. And let's put some real numbers on it. If we have a fresh cut flower, the vapor pressure, and I forget what the ambient number was for this, but for the purpose here is 23.39 millibars or 0.34 psi if we convert millibars to psi. And what we want to do is dry this flower in a controlled space with a vapor pressure of 14.24 millibars or 0.121 psi. So what's going to happen here? Because the room is at a vapor pressure that's not quite half that of the flower, the free available water is going to leave this flower, and the flower is going to come to equilibrium. I can show this in a little bit more detail here, where here's a flower that you want in a controlled space. And we're going back to those numbers on the relative humidity chart that showed the 60%. And here we have a dry bulb temperature of 68. We have a dew point of 54, which equates to a relative humidity of 61%. And that vapor pressure is 14.24 millibars. That's the conditioned space we want to dry the flower in. But here are some of the real world challenges. If you have it in a room and you're trying to maintain those conditions, and it's a winter day outside, and it's 20 degrees, and the dew point is 14 degrees, wow, it's 80% relative humidity, but it's bone dry. Your vapor pressure in that outside is 2.86 millibars or 0.04 psi. You compare that to where you want your flower, it is 3 times drier outside, or the vapor pressure that you're targeting, that you want that flower stored in, is 3 times greater. So now you think about that tire and how the vapor pressure is going to want to equalize with what's going in the space where you're keeping your flower, and that vapor pressure is going to want to go right outside. So this is why construction and details of the rooms and spaces that you dry and cure are important. Now let's take the flip side. Another 80% relative humidity day, except it's a summer day and it's 85 degrees outside. And so the vapor pressure equates to 31.61 millibars or 0.46 psi. Well, now the vapor pressure outside is 3.8 times greater than what you want to be drying that flower and storing that flower at. So guess what? All that water vapor outside is going to want to come right inside that room where you're trying to dry and cure. Now, when we subject it to mechanical cooling equipment, this is where we're playing with dehumidifiers and air conditioners. Most refrigeration equipment today is using R410A and as a refrigerant. And when R410A has suction pressure at 95 psi, which is typical coming off on the suction side. You're looking at a dew point of 29 degrees on that evaporator coil, which means that evaporator coil is operating at 5.41 millibars or 0.08 psi. And we really want the room where we're storing the flour to be at 0.121 psi. So that means that the room is 2.6 times greater vapor pressure than what's happening at that coil. So every time that compressor in that dehumidifier or mini split comes on, the pressure, the vapor pressure at that evaporator coil is almost 3 times lower than what you want at the flour. So every time it's running, boy, it's creating a real low vapor pressure, and that water is just leaving that flour. That's why eventually you need to remove the flour and arrest the drying process, or it's going to over dry. Every time that compressor comes on, you got that really low vapor pressure spike going on. So you put all of this together, and now you've got your flour in a targeted condition space. And then you've got rooms that are built with suspended ceilings, open trusses, and there's this constant battle of what's going on in the real world with seasonal changes, and why we struggle with trying to dry and cure flour with conventional systems and get consistent flour in various parts of the country at various times of the year. Now, making this work is not a new idea. Controlling vapor pressure has been used for cheese aging rooms, meat curing, dry aging rooms. The physics is all the same. Instead of a flour where you want to get rid of the free available water, you've got meat or cheese that you want to get rid of the free available water, and you want to get it to a target water activity because you want your product to be shelf stable. And who uses, this science? The science is water activity. It's used by farmer. It's used in food. This is how you get repeatable, consistent results. And there's no guesswork in, oh, is it dry enough? Is it too dry? No, this is science, and it's using water activity. Now, on a lot of cannabis COA reports, there might be a field that has a water activity value. And very often that value is not measured, it's left open. But the key is when you're measuring water activity and you're using science, now you're measuring free available water versus bound water. When there's unbound water in a product, and whether it's a cannabis flour or it's meat or it's cheese, mold and microbes will feed on that free available water. If the water is bound up in the molecules and the water molecules are bound up in the cell structures, there's no free available water for mold and microbes to grow on. You have a shelf-stable product. So the optimum water activity is 0.6. At 0.6, you no longer have that free available water for the microbes and mold to feed on, and you've achieved shelf stability, and you've optimized your yield. Drying a product below the 0.6 water activity, you are now removing molecules of bound water, and that bound water that you're losing impacts the quality of the product and the weight of the product. So the key is placing the flour into a space that has controlled vapor pressure and allowing that flour to dry and then come to equilibrium with that space. At that point, you're not going to be losing any more water. You can't over dry the flour. It's just now curing. So now you're looking at a continuum. Basically, you're putting wet flour in a space with controlled vapor pressure. The free available water is going to leave that flour, and it's going to come to equilibrium in the space, and now it's curing. There's no moving it, jar, burping, or anything like that. And you can leave it in there indefinitely. It can't over dry because it's at equilibrium. A really good analogy is sous vide, sort of the sous vide for weed. Anyone who's cooked with sous vide knows that you can cook a protein, a meat, a fish to an exact doneness, an exact temperature, and then leave it for hours. It's not going to get overcooked because it's at the final temperature you want. And whether it's small pieces or large pieces of protein or mixed, they're all going to finish to the exact same thing. So the same thing happens with a cannabis flower. You can have your little popcorns and your big colas. They're all going to eventually dry to the same 0.6 water activity. Unlike drying with conventional methods, where your little popcorn's going to dry faster and get over dried as compared to your large colas, you'll never be able to have them both the same, just because of the size difference, unless you pull the small ones before you pull the big ones. And boy, that is some labor intensive work. So a lot of people say, well, I measure my flour based on percent moisture. Well, that's the total moisture in the flour. It's not expressing bound and unbound water. So it's not very meaningful, especially if you're selling your product by weight. So who uses water activity for testing the dryness and how shelf stable their product is? The pharmaceutical industry, the food industry, and the cannabis industry should be. Who uses percent moisture? Well, people who sell firewood, people who sell lumber, people who sell hay. They're selling their product by volume, not by weight. They don't care if they've removed extra water from it. They're just selling it by volume. People who sell their product by weight, they want to capture every single gram, every single molecule of water they don't need to remove from their product. They want in that product so they have a more robust, higher yields. So what are we all the benefits of this is that once we hit that 0.6 water activity and we're reached equilibrium, well, the flower just starts curing. There's no additional steps necessary. There's no additional loss of bound water. So you now wind up with higher yields. You're not over drying the product and winding up with a lighter product and losing revenue. And, all the inputs went into that: lighting, nutrients, the labor. And then if you over dry it, that's just lost revenue. And what you're getting with this is constant, consistent, repeatable results. And back to every molecule of water you lose, that's lost revenue. And here's a good example. On the left here, we're using 0.6 water activity of flour, and we're going to call that our control. Then we took flour and we dried it to a 0.55 water activity, 0.5 water activity, 4.5, and 4.0. And what we did is we measured the weight, the corresponding weight. And the bottom here is how much weight was lost due to over drying. So if you're drying flour to a 0.5 water activity, you've lost 5.6% of your revenue to weight because of over drying. And there was absolutely no gain in over drying that. You're losing product quality, you're losing product yield. These could be some staggering numbers to some facilities that are producing millions of dollars. If by controlling the vapor pressure in a dry cure space, we were in a facility recently that had less than a 2-month payback. And here we did a study, and we can compliment the Cannabis Research Coalition, and came up with some real meaningful numbers on the difference between the amount of terpenes that were retained in the flower as compared to a legacy 60/60 drying system. And the results came in at around 16%, which is pretty significant for people who are interested in terpene retention in their flower. So once you have this type of control in post-harvest, people are now really dialing in the vapor pressure and the way that they're curing the product, and different cultivars are curing differently. We're finding some cultivars really don't benefit a whole lot from a longer cure, where other cultivars really do benefit from a longer cure. And this is true when you start getting into cheese, wine, scotch, whiskey, and people will pay a premium for a product that is cured or aged for a longer period of time. But, just like wine, you can buy some cheap wine and it might not do a whole lot leaving it around for any length of time. It might even just deteriorate and get poor. Where other wines, back to the cultivars, the varieties of the grapes, after 10 years will get better. Now, no one's suggesting to keep a cannabis flower around for 10 years, but definitely we're seeing differences in the order of weeks. And we do have facilities now that are selling 30, 60, 90-day cure periods and able to get a premium for it. Also, if you're able then to properly store flower, you can ride out market fluctuations. Very often, if there's a big outdoor grow region, there's a lot of flower that becomes available on the market. So facilities can then hold their flower until that surge of flower dries up a bit as far as supply, and then they can come into the market with a longer term cured, really high quality flower. So all of this brings to people who are in commercial improved profitability. They're increasing their yield by not over drying it. They're coming out with a better product with exactly the same inputs. You're reducing labor because you're not handling the flower from drying, then moving it to curing, and then burping. And also, you're getting to the market faster with the flower. This all then leads to some really good SOPs for manufacturing. You're no longer depending on that person that's got that bro science squeezy feely. Is the flour done yet? Is it time to pull it from the drying space, moving it to the jars and burping? This really helps with GMP compliance because you really have a repeatable system. You're also improving the shelf stability of the flour. We hear that from a lot of facilities. We have a medical facility, that told us once they set up their dry cure using the Vapotrol technology, and now when they get variances in their finished product, they know that the dry cure is consistent and they go further back, nutrients, feeding, watering, lighting, what potentially impacted. But what they do recognize is their dry cure is consistent. They're not experiencing any variability there seasonally. It just, as long as the numbers are there, it works. Now, this also then for brand loyalty, because now the consumer is going to get consistent quality in every market. So if it's a multi-state operator, if flower is sold in multiple states, they can have a consistent product. Even within a state, and if it's seasonal changes, the same product seasonally is going to be the same. It's not going to vary. You wind up with a higher quality product, and that means the consumer keeps coming back for more. So if you have good control of post-harvest, all the inputs and hard work that went into it now can shine. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, David, for joining us for our October CRC Member Cafe. We appreciate it. And we will definitely present this presentation and PowerPoint along with this. So you can download it and find out more. And in the meantime, if you want to reach out to any of us, you can at Ashley@thehempmine.com, and we can put you in touch with David or Jane at Canatrol. Thanks, David.
Thank you.